like and subscribe. Beyond Antarctica. Chapter 16. Surrounding the makeshift camp, the tension among the Celeb Mariner's crew was alarming. They had been hearing rustling and distant murmurs from the woods all day, but now, as twilight turned to dusk, the noises grew closer, more distinct. Tony whispered to the crew nearby, "We're being watched." He nodded toward the tree line, where the white of its eyes peeked out from the darkness. But before they could react, two figures emerged from the shadows. Two small men, barely 4 feet tall and clad in makeshift garments of leaves and vines, stepped into the clearing. Their presence was so unexpected, so out of place, that it momentarily disarmed the crew. Tony, with a cautious hand on the pistol tucked into his belt, approached them. His voice was low but clear. "Who are you?" The men, clearly nervous, exchanged glances before one of them, braver or perhaps just more desperate, stepped forward. After hours of Tony drawing in the sand, he informed John what he got from their meeting. "They are survivors," he began. "Escaped slaves from across the waters. The women warriors took everything, their families, their homes. They fled here to hide, to live. Their villages raided, and their people killed or enslaved. They're not our enemies. They are victims of the same brutal tribal conflicts that had nearly ensnared the Celeb Mariner's crew," he told John. "It seems they have been on this island for months. The sea claimed many of their brothers. Only 8 of them remain, out of thousands." He gestured toward the camp. Bick led them out, slowly. The figures emerged, each one as ragged and weary as the last. John, seeing the state of these men, didn't hesitate. "Get them some food and water," he ordered. The crew quickly complied, setting up a campfire. As the newcomers hungrily devoured the food offered, they shared their stories. Each tale was a harrowing account of escape and survival, of families torn apart and homes destroyed by a ferocious tribe of women warriors who spared no man in their path. One of the elders, a wiry man with a sharp gaze, made it clear they needed to go back. They needed to know if any survived, if their families are still there, the weight of unspoken horrors lingering in his eyes. John made it clear that they would take them back. "Prepare the ship for departure at dawn," he commanded. The night passed with an air of solemnity. Tony spent the hours going over plans with the elders, learning as much as he could about the mainland and the dangers they might face. Bick and Todd worked on the ship, ensuring it was ready for what might come. As dawn broke over the island, with the engines repaired and spirits bolstered, the Celeb Mariner set sail toward the mainland and the unknown. Arriving at the mainland, the elders guided the Celeb Mariner to a cove cradled by a winding river that stretched deep into the lush landscape. Following the river for an hour, the crew's eyes widened as they approached a city that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Its architecture was primitive yet undeniably majestic. As they docked, the elders stepped onto the pier. Soon, a large crowd gathered, buzzing with curiosity. Then emerged a regally dressed figure whose intricate attire contrasted sharply with the simpler garments of the others. This figure approached the elders with a solemn nod before turning their attention to John. With formalities brief but warm, John was invited to partake in the city's hospitality. Food rich with exotic flavors and spiced drinks were offered, setting the tone for what was to become a night of celebration. As dusk fell, the golden city transformed. Lights flickered to life, casting dancing shadows over stone and gold, while the air filled with the melodies of ancient songs and the rhythmic beat of drums. The festival was unlike anything the crew had ever witnessed, a spectacle of joy that belied the heavy burden these people bore. An elder, his face lined with years of wisdom, shared the harrowing cost of their safety. "Our children are the price of peace," he explained through drawings and hand gestures. "At the age of 10, half of our children are given over to the warriors. It's our tribute to prevent their wrath. If we fail to comply, they have vowed to destroy everything. for returning their loved ones who had fled the devastating raids. The inhabitants of the Golden City generously loaded the Celeb Mariner with provisions. Large baskets filled with fresh fruits, grains, and dried meats were carefully stored in the ship's hold, ensuring the crew would not want for sustenance in their ongoing travels. Additionally, barrels of the city's finest ale, brewed from a unique blend of local grains and infused with the zest of exotic fruits, were brought aboard. The generosity of the city's people was a heartwarming moment, fostering a sense of deep gratitude as they sealed a newfound alliance with a shared toast of golden ale under the stars. As the night's festivities dwindled, a sense of unease crept into John's merriment. The ale, while invigorating, seemed overly potent, blurring the edges of his consciousness. Sensing the crew may have overdrank, he called for an end to the evening's revelry. "That's a wrap, crew," he announced, attempting to stand, yet his legs betrayed him, buckling under an unfamiliar dizziness, and then darkness enveloped him. His vision cleared to reveal a grim scene. He was trapped in a cage suspended above the city square, swaying slightly in the early morning breeze. In the air, the stench of rotting fruit that kids hurled at another cage nearby. Kim's, her stoic silence in the face of their taunts made his heart wrench. His shouts for them to stop were lost in the wind, ignored by the cheering crowd below. His eyes scanned the surroundings, noting with a sinking heart that their ship, the Celeb Mariner, was being commandeered by the locals. The deck was chaotic, with the townspeople hastily mounting 2 large trebuchets. The tribal leader approached with a smug smirk. John's gaze hardened, meeting the leader's eyes with a glare that could kill. "Stay calm, men," he instructed, his voice a strained whisper through the bars of his cage. Despite the precariousness of their situation, John's command carried a weight of leadership that didn't waver, even as the sense of betrayal gnawed at him. How could a gesture of goodwill have been repaid with such treachery, he thought to himself. As the city awoke to the spectacle of their captivity, John knew they needed a plan, and fast. The crew of the Celeb Mariner found themselves in a dire predicament, each confined within individual cages. As John assessed their grim situation, "Tony, see how these cages latch," he called out. Tony craned his neck, squinting at the mechanism. "There's a clasp that hangs underneath, John. Each cage has one," he reported, his tone tinged with frustration. "Yeah, impossible to reach from inside," Todd mused aloud, recognizing the well-thought-out design. "It's just a lever, though. We might be able to—" He trailed off, catching himself as the tribal leader began making grand gestures towards them. The entire scene took a surreal turn as John couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. "What's so funny?" Todd asked from his adjacent cage. John shook his head in disbelief. "He wants to know how the ship operates and how Kim's magic keeps the monsters away," he explained, amusement still lacing his tone. "I told him it's Bob's magic that drives the ship and Kim's that keeps them away." Todd glanced at the leader, who was now jumping up and down in frustration. "Okay, but why is he so animated?" "He wants to save his people from the warriors, flee to the islands, and eventually attack the warriors' main capital from the sea. He thinks the Celeb Mariner could pulverize their city from an untouchable position on the water." John elucidated, his laughter fading as the gravity of their captor's plans sank in. "He offered riches and an afterlife of glory if we helped. When I refused, he threatened to kill the crew. I told him that harming us would destroy the very magic that Bob and Kim rely on, the magic that he hopes to harness. He feels trapped now, powerless. He cannot harm them without harming his own plans," John added, his voice hardening as he observed their captor's desperation. Meanwhile, Tony, unable to tolerate the children tormenting Kim with fruit any longer, burst out with a string of curses, spitting down at them in defiance. This only redirected their cruelty towards him, intensifying their assault with a newfound ferocity, but now at him. As John observed the tribal leaders' mounting frustration and Tony's spirited defense of Kim, he knew that their survival depended on escaping these cages and outsmarting a desperate leader whose plans for the Celeb Mariner could spell disaster for entire populations along the coast. John shared a glance among the crew, a silent vow they would not let this city become their tomb. As darkness enveloped the city square, an eerie stillness settled around the suspended cages. The night was punctuated only by the occasional howl of a distant creature, underscoring the grim reality of their captivity. Bob, crammed uncomfortably into his small cage, chuckled ruefully. "I can barely move in here, Todd, but let's give it a shot." He struggled for a moment, the sound of his belt unbuckling echoing strangely in the quiet night. John, hanging nearby, turned his head towards Todd. "What's your plan?" "It's simple, really," Todd explained. "If I can link our belts together, I might be able to snag that lever and get your cage open. Then you could free everyone." "It's worth a try," John agreeing. Bob, with considerable effort, managed to wriggle enough to free his belt, and, with a well-aimed toss, sent it swinging towards Todd. Todd caught it deftly, his fingers working quickly in the dim light to fasten the two belts into a makeshift rope. With the combined length of the belts, Todd swung the improvised tool towards the lever beneath John's cage. The silence of the night was shattered as the belt latched onto the lever with a satisfying click. Todd pulled with all his might, and the bottom of John's cage suddenly swung open. John was unprepared for the sudden release. He plummeted towards the ground, landing with a heavy thud that sent a nearby table overturning, its contents crashing to the cobblestones in a cacophony that reverberated through the square. Lights flickered on in nearby buildings, and within moments armed men rushed out, their torches casting long shadows. John, still reeling from his fall, was quickly seized by the guards. Despite his attempts to fight back, the guards struck him. The blows came hard and fast, subduing him with brutal efficiency. The tribal leader, awakened by the commotion, appeared in the square. His face twisted in fury as he approached John, who was now held firmly to the ground by two burly guards. Through gritted teeth, the leader issued a chilling ultimatum. "If you don't help us use the ship, no one will. And if you refuse, the girl dies first." A sinister promise that tightened the leader's grip over John's fate. As John was dragged away, his eyes met Kim's across the square. In that fleeting glance, he knew he had to save not just Kim, but everyone from the fate the city leader had planned. As dawn broke over the golden city, the piercing sound of trumpets echoed through the streets, heralding the approach of the tribal leader. As he paced in front of the crew, who were forced to their knees and lined up like captives of war. With a menacing grace, he placed the tip of his spear against Kim's throat, his gaze locking with John's in a silent demand for a decision. The weight of the moment pressing down on John. Just as he was about to gesture his reluctant agreement to help, Tony made a desperate move. He leapt up, let out a scream that could have woke the dead, and lunged for the leader, only to be brutally subdued by two guards. They struck his legs with their spears, forcing him back down with a force that sent his head crashing against the cobblestone. The sound of his head bouncing off the rock sent a shiver down Kim's spine. With a heavy heart, John finally nodded, signaling their capitulation. The crew was promptly escorted to the Celeb Mariner and locked in the cargo hold, leaving only Kim, Bob, and John in the city square under watchful eyes of the city leader. Suddenly, the trumpets sounded again, this time in a rapid, urgent succession. The leader's attention snapped towards the city gates as a massive dust cloud rolled over the city walls. It wasn't a sandstorm being stirred, but the thunderous pounding of thousands of hooves on a dirt road, the unmistakable sound of an approaching army. As the dust settled, a formidable horde of female warriors turned the corner. Leading the charge was a woman wearing a golden crown and carrying a golden scepter with a snake's head, adorned with red rubies as eyes. She rode straight to the city square, her presence commanding silence from the onlookers. The streets quickly filled with her troops. Fear gripped the city as residents scrambled and ran to their homes and hid. Even the guards dropped their weapons, falling to their knees and bowing before her. The city leader knelt and bowed repeatedly before the golden-crowned warrior. With a gesture of command, she made him stand. She dismounted with regal authority and approached him, pointing towards the Celeb Mariner anchored at the dock. His men on board now overwhelmed by the sea of warriors now filling every corner of the city. John and Bob exchanged glances of disbelief at the sheer number of warriors, easily tens of thousands surrounding them, not counting the additional forces they couldn't see. The size and might of this gathering were beyond anything they had imagined. Kim said, "Guys, see the dust rising in the distance? That's miles of horses coming down that road. I think we just fell out of the frying pan and into the fire." As she spoke, the female leader's head snapped towards Kim, her gaze sharp. With a cry, she struck the city leader across the face with her scepter, opening a gash that poured blood down his face. He whimpered, clutching his cheek as she signaled to his men. They quickly moved to untie Kim and helped her to her feet, her presence now demanded by the warrior queen herself. As the warrior queen closely examined Kim, she gently wiped away remnants of rotten food and delicately picked something from her hair. Her demeanor shifted as she caressed Kim's blonde hair, stepping back to offer a deep bow while raising her scepter high. With a ferocious cry that seemed to shake the very earth, she swung the scepter with incredible force at the city leader, striking him squarely on the head and rendering him unconscious. Stepping back to Kim, the queen took a moment to recognize the significance of the young woman before her. Getting a closer look, Kim realized this was the warrior she had previously encountered, the one who had been wounded on the ship yet had helped to save Kim's life in their earlier interactions, the one her father freed. She must have been the daughter of the fallen queen, now queen herself. In a gesture of respect and connection, Kim took out her knife, cut off her own ponytail, and handed it to the warrior queen. The queen affixed it to the back of her crown, turned to her army, and raised her scepter aloft, eliciting a resounding chorus of shouts and cries from the assembled warriors. The queen then approached Todd, grabbed him by the hair, and dragged him towards a cliff overlooking the river. Holding him over the edge in a heart-stopping moment, she abruptly pulled him back and kissed his cheek and laughed heartily as she released him. She then helped John to his feet and made a series of gestures, first towards the Celeb Mariner, then out to the ocean, and finally held up one finger pointing to the sky. Repeating the gesture emphatically, John understood she was giving them one day to leave with their ship. As John hastened his crew towards the ship, urging them to hurry, the queen halted him one last time. She pointed skyward, held up one finger, and then theatrically swung her scepter overhead. Her troops quickly mounted their horses and, following her lead, rode out of the city in a disciplined and orderly fashion. As the last of the crew scrambled onto the Celeb Mariner, John took one final look back at the receding figures of the warrior queen and her army. He felt the weight of the day's events pressing down upon him, the future uncertain. As the engines of the Celeb Mariner roared to life, a chill ran down his spine, not from the evening air, but from the eerie silence that had settled over the river. In that silence, a soft, haunting melody began to drift across the water from the engines. As the ship began to pull away, John couldn't shake the feeling that their departure was being watched by unseen eyes, and that their troubles were far from over. This is not goodbye, nor the end. Until the story continues, my friends, B.N.Rocker.